Greetings, this is Richard Fleming, and in this video I'm going to take a look at indie developers, independent developers, and publisher-owned developers. Now, the focus of this material is based on the book Fundamentals of Game Development by Heather and Raphael Chandler for Game 104. Now, the first thing I want to bring up in this little focus video is that the book does not deal with indie developers. Whenever the book refers to independent developers, indies are not what they're talking about. What I have on the web screen right now, on the web page right now, is an indie developer. No particular reason why I picked this one. I just went to indiedb.com news, scanned the posts, and pretty much picked one up at random that looked good. Now, there's no real solid consensus on what an indie developer is. There's a couple of fairly common threads, though. Thread number one, very small development team. Not uncommon to be one-man shows, although more typically they're between 3 to 5 developers, maybe. Usually not much more than that. The other common thread for indie developers is a shoestring budget, as in they usually don't have much of a budget. It's very common for an indie developer to either have a donate button on their website like these guys, or to try to run a Kickstarter campaign to raise funds, to pay for contractors to do things that they can't do. The other, and this is like a really key component of an indie developer, is that they don't have publishers. They do not go through a publisher, hence the shoestring budget problem. They are completely self-published, Steam being a popular self-publishing point, but quite frequently they'll also sell their games just straight off their webpage, maybe Desera or Good Old Games, someplace like that. So that's an indie developer. The book does not talk about them. Now, most of what the book mentions in terms of teams and development process and communication still holds true for the indie developer. Obviously, the stuff where it's talking about producers and developer producers and publisher producers doesn't really apply. Generally speaking, there's not a hardcore producer role on an indie team. They're just too small to really need that. But beyond that lack of a focused, specific producer role, pretty much everything the book says about the game development process applies to indie developers as well. Okay, moving on from indies, let's talk about independent developers. Now, an independent developer is somebody like Obsidian Entertainment, as I've got on the web right now. These guys develop games. They've got fairly good sized staff. They have producers in charge of projects. And for the most part, they go through publishers. They went through a publisher for Dungeon Siege 3. They went through a publisher for Knights of the Old Republic 2. Went through a publisher for their Fallout game. So on and so forth. You get the idea. A lot of their games that they make are made either specifically for someone else, or they're doing it through a publisher to get additional funds to actually create the game. Now, there are exceptions to that. Their Pillars of Eternity project, excuse me, is not publisher-backed. But for the most part, the work that they do here is done through or for a publisher, making them an independent developer. Now, a publisher-owned developer is somebody like BioWare. BioWare used to be independent, but then EA purchased them, and they became a publisher-owned developer. Now, this does have some impacts. The chance of the publisher, pardon the coughing, the chance of the publisher just simply axing the project is, or at least, just totally cutting loose and tossing the studio out and never doing any business with them again, it's actually kind of really unlikely that's going to happen. A publisher-owned studio has to really kind of have a history of screwing up before they get to that point that the publisher is going to shut them down. There's a little bit more security, there's both in terms of getting shut down and in terms of getting work. I mean, if the publisher owns you, they're going to be wanting you to make projects, not just sitting there draining funds that they could otherwise report to shareholders as profit. So there's a little bit more stability there in being a publisher-owned developer. However, there are definitely some downsides. The publisher has far more control when they own you versus them just giving you money. So there is that to keep in mind. Sort of switching back over to the independent developer side, you have to remember when the publisher works with an independent developer, the publisher really honestly isn't that interested in controlling every last little detail of the production. That's why they're giving the money to the developer. They want the developer to create the product. And so, like the book mentions, you'll generally have two producers in a publisher-produced project. You will have the developer producer, who is in charge of the day-to-day management of the game production, the game development. And then you will have the publisher producer, who's in charge of things on the publisher side. Because remember, the publisher has obligations too. They need to do marketing. They need to make sure that the licensing approvals are going through properly. For example, South Park Stick of Truth, conveniently that was up there at that moment. That was a licensed product. The publisher of that had to make sure that they were following the guidelines that the owner of South Park had. Of course, from what I understand, the owners of South Park, the creators, worked very closely with Obsidian directly. But still, you've got to make sure on the licensed IPs that you're not doing something you're not supposed to. Vegas, have to make sure that you're getting an approval from Bethesda and ZeniMax, that you're not violating some obscure little lore tidbit, or that you're staying in lore in the game. So there's that would be one of the major roles of a publisher producer, is helping to ensure that all of the licensing stuff is going smoothly. Like I mentioned, they've got marketing. They've got to, in the case of physical, if this game's going to be sold in the physical store, publisher's the one responsible for getting stuff packaged up and in the stores and contacting Best Buy and Micro Center and Walmart and saying, hey, put this on your shelf, please. So there's a lot of responsibility. There's a lot of responsibility on both sides. And so the producer does want to keep in contact with the developer to make sure things are going good. And that pretty much ends this little focus video. Just make sure that you read Chapter 2 carefully before you start up with the exam, and I'll talk to you guys in the next video.